Imagine you already know the story. Two worlds colliding, Christian knights charging across deserts, Muslim defenders repelling wave after wave of foreign invaders, a clash of civilizations stretching across 2 centuries, driven by religious fanaticism on one side and noble defense on the other. You have seen the movies. You have heard the speeches. You probably have a clear picture in your mind of what the Crusades were. Almost everything in that picture is wrong, not slightly off, not missing a few details. Fundamentally, structurally, dangerously wrong in ways that have shaped how the modern world understands itself, how politicians justify wars, how religious communities define their identities, and how entire civilizations remember their past. The Crusades are one of the most mythologized events in all of human history, claimed and distorted by so many different groups for so many different purposes that the actual history has been buried under centuries of competing propaganda. So let us dig it out. What you are about to hear is not the Crusades as a weapon or a wound. It is the Crusades as they actually happened. Stranger, more complicated, more human, and in many ways more disturbing than any simplified version allows. And by the end of this video, you will understand not just what the Crusades were, but why getting them wrong has cost us so much. Let us start at the beginning. Not the beginning you think, but the real one. The year is 1095. Pope Urban II stands before an enormous crowd assembled in a field outside the French city of Clermont. He is not a young man, and he knows the church he leads is in trouble. Not from external enemies, at least not yet, but from internal fractures. The papacy has been locked in a bitter struggle with the Holy Roman Emperor over who has the right to appoint church officials, a conflict historians call the investiture controversy. The Pope needs to reassert his authority. He needs something that will unite the fractured Christian world under his leadership. He finds it in a letter. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos has sent a delegation to the west asking for military help. The Seljuk Turks have been expanding aggressively into Byzantine territory, and after a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Manzikert in 10,000, the Byzantines have lost most of Anatolia, which is modern Turkey. Alexios is not asking for a holy war. He is asking for mercenaries, skilled soldiers he can pay and use to recover his lost lands. He wants a few thousand professional fighters. What Urban II does with that request is one of the most consequential acts of political repackaging in history. He transforms a Byzantine military request into a divine command. Standing before that crowd at Clermont, Urban does not talk about helping the Byzantines recover territory. He talks about liberating Jerusalem. He talks about the suffering of Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land. He talks about the sacred duty of Christian warriors to take up arms in God's name. He offers something extraordinary, complete remission of sins for anyone who goes on this campaign. Not reduced penance, not spiritual credit. Full forgiveness, the spiritual equivalent of wiping the slate clean. The crowd's response, according to contemporary accounts, was a roar. Deus vult. God wills it. Here is your first major misconception. The Crusades were not primarily a response to Muslim aggression against Christianity. They were, at their origin, a calculated political move by a pope trying to consolidate power, repackaged as a religious obligation, responding to a Byzantine emperor's request for mercenaries that was itself a response to Seljuk expansion that had been underway for decades. The religious framing was real, the faith of many participants was genuine, but the institutional machinery that launched the First Crusade was thoroughly political. And the situation in Jerusalem that Urban described, it was considerably more complicated than his speech suggested. Jerusalem had been under Muslim rule since 630 Thirsin, when the Caliph Umar conquered it from the Byzantines. For most of those 4.5 centuries, Christian pilgrims had been able to visit the holy sites with relative freedom. The city was sacred to 3 religions, and pragmatic Muslim rulers generally found it more profitable to allow pilgrimage than to suppress it. There were periods of tension and occasional persecution, most notably under the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim, who destroyed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in 1009, an act that genuinely shocked the Christian world. But al-Hakim was widely considered unstable even by his own people, and his successor reversed most of his policies. By 1095, the pilgrimage routes to Jerusalem had become more difficult and dangerous, largely because of the political fragmentation caused by Seljuk expansion and the resulting instability across the region. But the image Urban painted of Christians being systematically slaughtered and prevented from worshipping was a dramatic amplification of a more complex reality. It was effective rhetoric. It was not accurate reporting. Now here is something that almost never makes it into popular accounts of the Crusades, and it should. The people who responded most immediately and enthusiastically to Urban's call were not the knights and nobles he was targeting. They were ordinary people. Peasants, minor clergy, the poor, the desperate. Inspired by a charismatic preacher named Peter the Hermit, tens of thousands of common people gathered in what historians call the People's Crusade, or sometimes the Peasants' Crusade, and began marching toward Jerusalem months before the official military campaign even organized itself. They had almost no military training, almost no supplies, and almost no plan beyond a burning conviction that God would provide. Before they even left Europe, this movement turned murderous. As they marched through the Rhineland in Germany, mobs attacked Jewish communities in cities like Worms, Mainz, and Cologne. The reasoning, such as it was, if they were marching to fight the enemies of Christ in the Holy Land, why not start with the Jews living among them? Thousands of Jewish men, women, and children were massacred. Some communities chose mass suicide rather than forced conversion. This is one of the darkest and most important facts about the Crusades that the popular narrative consistently erases. The First Crusade did not begin with Christians fighting Muslims. It began with Christians massacring Jews. The Rhineland massacres of 1096 represent one of the worst episodes of anti-Semitic violence in medieval European history, and they were directly triggered by the crusading fervor Urban had unleashed. Local bishops tried to protect Jewish communities, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. The violence was not official church policy, but it was a direct consequence of the movement the church had created. The People's Crusade itself ended in catastrophe. When the poorly armed and disorganized masses finally crossed into Byzantine territory and then into Seljuk lands, they were massacred by Turkish forces near Nicaea. Peter the Hermit survived, having conveniently gone back to Constantinople before the final disaster. Most of his followers did not. The actual military campaign, the First Crusade proper, was a different operation, led by major nobles including Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, and others. It was a substantial military force of perhaps 60 to 100,000 people, including fighters, pilgrims, and support personnel. It was also, by any objective measure, extraordinarily successful in military terms. They crossed Anatolia, winning key battles, capturing Nicaea and Dorylaeum. They endured a brutal siege at Antioch, nearly starving before a combination of military ingenuity and what they believed was divine intervention turned the tide. And then, in July of 1099, after a siege of 5 weeks, they took Jerusalem. What happened next is the moment that has haunted the Crusades' memory ever since. The Crusaders massacred the population of Jerusalem. The scale and nature of this massacre has been debated by historians, and it is worth being precise here rather than either minimizing or exaggerating. Contemporary Christian sources, written by participants who seemed proud of what they had done, describe the streets running with blood and the Crusaders wading through gore up to their ankles. These accounts are almost certainly rhetorical exaggerations, a common literary convention of the time meant to convey the totality of victory rather than literal physical description. Modern historians, examining the archaeological and documentary evidence, estimate the actual death toll was substantial, but not as apocalyptic as the most dramatic accounts suggest. The Jewish community of Jerusalem, who had been sheltering in a synagogue, was also killed or enslaved. Here is what matters. By the standards of medieval warfare, a city that refused to surrender and was taken by storm could expect no mercy. This was not unique to the Crusaders. Muslim commanders did the same. Byzantine commanders did the same. This was how warfare worked in the 11th century. The massacre at Jerusalem was horrific by any human standard, but it was not an exceptional atrocity by the military norms of its time. What was exceptional was how it was remembered, celebrated in Crusader chronicles, mourned in Muslim and Jewish sources, and eventually transformed into a symbol of Christian barbarism in modern discourse. The massacre happened. It was real, but the meaning assigned to it has shifted dramatically across the centuries depending on who was doing the remembering and why. Now we reach the second great misconception, and this one is perhaps the most persistent. The Crusades were not a simple story of Christian aggression and Muslim victimhood. The Muslim world of the 11th century was not a unified civilization standing together against a common enemy. It was deeply, bitterly divided. The two major Islamic powers of the time, the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate and its Seljuk overlords on one side, and the Shia Fatimid Caliphate based in Cairo on the other, were rivals who sometimes hated each other more than they hated any external enemy. When the Crusaders arrived in the Levant, they were not crashing into a monolithic Islamic civilization. They were entering a fractured political landscape where different Muslim rulers sometimes preferred to deal with the Crusaders than to cooperate with their Muslim rivals. In fact, the Fatimids of Egypt had actually lost Jerusalem to the Seljuks just a year before the Crusaders arrived. There is documentary evidence suggesting the Fatimids were in contact with the Crusaders during their march, hoping the Christian army might help them recover the city from the Seljuks. That negotiation obviously did not end the way the Fatimids hoped. But it illustrates the fundamental reality. This was not a clash of two unified civilizations. It was a complex, shifting, multipolar conflict in which religion was one factor among many. The Crusader states that emerged from the First Crusade, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, were not isolated Christian outposts in a hostile sea. They were political entities that traded with their Muslim neighbors, formed alliances with Muslim rulers against other Christian rulers, hired Muslim soldiers, and over time developed a distinctive Levantine culture that blended Christian, Muslim, and Jewish elements in ways that would have horrified the Crusades' original preachers. The Franks, as the Muslim world called the Crusaders and their descendants, learned Arabic. They adopted local dress in the brutal summer heat. They ate local food, used local medicine, and sometimes formed genuine friendships with their Muslim counterparts. The Italian merchant cities of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, which provided the naval power that kept the Crusader states alive, were simultaneously trading partners with Muslim Egypt. At the height of Crusader-Muslim conflict, Venetian merchants were selling Egyptian grain and Syrian spices in European markets. Commerce did not stop for religion. This does not mean the Crusades were peaceful, or that the violence was exaggerated. It means the reality was far more human and far more complicated than the clash of civilizations narrative allows. Let us talk about Saladin, because almost everything the popular imagination believes about Saladin is a distortion, though an interesting one. Saladin, properly Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, was a Kurdish military commander who rose to power in Egypt and eventually unified much of the Muslim Levant under his control. In 1187, at the Battle of Hattin, he decisively defeated the Crusader army, and then, over the following months, reconquered most of the Crusader kingdom, including Jerusalem itself. His entry into Jerusalem in October 1187 is almost always contrasted with the Crusader massacre of 1199. Where the Crusaders had killed, Saladin was merciful. He allowed the Christian population to ransom themselves and leave. He protected the Eastern Christian communities. He allowed Christian pilgrims to continue visiting the holy sites. He is remembered in both Western and Islamic tradition as a model of chivalric virtue, the noble enemy. This reputation is not entirely wrong. Saladin was genuinely more restrained than many commanders of his era, and his treatment of Jerusalem's population in 1187 was notably humane by 12th century standards. But the popular image strips out the complexity. Saladin was also capable of ruthlessness. After Hattin, he personally oversaw the execution of the captured Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller, the military orders he considered the most dangerous enemies of Islam. He was a skilled political operator who used religion strategically, invoking jihad when it served his purposes and making pragmatic truces when it did not. He spent years fighting other Muslim rulers. He was human, not a saint, and the hagiographic version of Saladin that has become standard in both Western and Islamic popular culture tells us more about what each tradition needed from him than about who he actually was. The Western tradition adopted Saladin as the noble enemy, partly because medieval chivalric culture needed an opponent worthy of respect, and partly because later European writers, particularly during the Enlightenment, found it useful to contrast his supposed tolerance with Crusader violence. The Islamic tradition elevated him as the great liberator of Jerusalem, the restorer of Muslim honor, a figure whose memory became especially powerful in the 19th and 20th centuries as the Muslim world confronted European colonialism and needed heroes. Both traditions are using Saladin. The real man was more interesting than either version. Now let us address the Third Crusade, which is the one most people actually know something about, largely because of Richard got the Pear of England. Richard, known to history as Richard the Lionheart, is one of those historical figures whose reputation has been shaped almost entirely by legend and nationalist mythology. In English popular culture, he is the noble king, the great warrior, the Crusader hero. The reality is considerably stranger. Richard spent almost his entire reign outside England. He spoke French, not English. He viewed England primarily as a source of revenue to fund his military campaigns. He sold offices, titles, and privileges to raise money for the crusade, reportedly saying he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer. He was an exceptional military commander, genuinely gifted in siege warfare and battlefield tactics. He was also capable of acts that would be considered war crimes by any modern standard. The most disturbing of these was the massacre at Acre in 1191. After the fall of the city, Richard held approximately 2,700 Muslim prisoners, soldiers and their families, who had been captured during the siege. Negotiations over their ransom and the return of a fragment of the true cross broke down. Whether through impatience, military calculation, or genuine rage, Richard ordered them all killed. The massacre at Acre was not a battle. It was an execution. This event is often omitted from popular accounts of Richard, or mentioned briefly and then moved past. It matters, it complicates the heroic narrative, and it had consequences. When Muslim commanders subsequently heard that Richard's forces were approaching, they sometimes killed their own prisoners rather than risk them being recaptured and used against them. Violence escalated violence. Richard and Saladin never actually met, despite what countless novels and films suggest. They negotiated through intermediaries, exchanged gifts, and expressed mutual respect in the courtly diplomatic language of the time. The Treaty of Jaffa in 1192, which ended the Third Crusade, was a pragmatic compromise. The Crusaders kept the coastal cities, Muslims kept Jerusalem, and Christian pilgrims were guaranteed access to the holy sites. Neither side got everything they wanted. Both sides got something they could live with. Richard left the Holy Land and never returned. He died 8 years later from a crossbow wound sustained during a minor siege in France, fighting over a treasure dispute with one of his own vassals. The great Crusader king was killed not by a Muslim warrior, but by a French peasant boy defending a local lord's castle. History is often like that. The Fourth Crusade is where things get truly bizarre, and it represents perhaps the most important corrective to the standard narrative. In 1202, a new crusading army assembled in Venice, intending to attack Muslim Egypt, which had become the strategic heart of Islamic power in the region. What happened next was a catastrophic sequence of political manipulation, debt, and opportunism that resulted in the Crusaders never getting anywhere near Egypt or Jerusalem. The Crusaders had contracted with Venice for transport ships, promising a payment they could not actually deliver. Deeply in debt to the Venetians, they were persuaded to repay the debt by helping Venice attack the Christian city of Zara on the Adriatic coast. The Pope excommunicated the entire crusade for attacking a Christian city. They went ahead anyway. Then, through a complicated series of political maneuvers involving a Byzantine prince named Alexios, who promised enormous rewards if the Crusaders helped him reclaim his father's throne in Constantinople, the army was diverted to the Byzantine capital. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople, not Jerusalem, not Cairo. Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the world, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the city that had preserved Roman civilization for 8 centuries, while Western Europe was in its so-called Dark Ages. The Crusaders looted it with a thoroughness that shocked even contemporary observers. Priceless artworks, relics, manuscripts, and treasures accumulated over centuries were stolen, destroyed, or melted down. The famous bronze horses now in Venice were taken from the Hippodrome of Constantinople. The city was divided among the Crusaders and their Venetian creditors. A Latin empire was established in Constantinople that lasted until 1261. The Fourth Crusade was not a crusade against Islam. It was a Christian army destroying the greatest Christian city in the world for political and financial gain. Pope Innocent III, who had originally called the crusade, was reportedly horrified. He also eventually accepted the outcome. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 created a wound in the relationship between Eastern and Western Christianity that has never fully healed. The Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church had been formally divided since 1074, but the Fourth Crusade turned theological disagreement into genuine, lasting hatred. When Constantinople finally fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, some Byzantine Christians reportedly said they would rather see the turban of the Sultan than the mitre of a Catholic cardinal. The Fourth Crusade had made the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople easier by permanently destroying any possibility of unified Christian defense. This is a cause and effect relationship of enormous historical importance that almost never appears in popular accounts of the Crusades. Let us pause here and address something that needs to be said directly. The Crusades have been weaponized by modern political actors on multiple sides, and this weaponization has made honest historical understanding almost impossible. On one side, there is a tradition in certain Western, and specifically Christian nationalist circles of treating the Crusades as a noble defensive war, a justified response to centuries of Muslim expansion, a heroic chapter that should be reclaimed with pride. This narrative, which became particularly prominent in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, selectively emphasizes Muslim conquests while ignoring the complex political context of the Crusades' origins, the violence against Jews and Eastern Christians, the commercial motivations of Italian city-states, and the frequent wars between Crusader states and their Christian neighbors. On the other side, there is a tradition in certain Muslim political circles and in some Western progressive discourse of treating the Crusades as the original sin of Western imperialism, the first act in a long story of Christian aggression against the Muslim world, a wound that explains and justifies contemporary grievances. This narrative, which also became prominent in the modern era, largely ignores the fact that the medieval Muslim world did not primarily experience the Crusades as a civilizational catastrophe. Contemporary Muslim chronicles treated the Crusader states largely as one regional nuisance among many, not as an existential threat to Islamic civilization. Here is a genuinely striking fact that undermines both narratives simultaneously. The great medieval Muslim scholar and traveler Ibn Jubayr visited the Crusader states in the 1180s and wrote about them with curious, relatively dispassionate observation. He noted that Muslim peasants sometimes preferred living under Crusader rule to living under their own Muslim lords because the Crusaders' tax rates were lower and more predictable. He was not endorsing Crusader rule. He was reporting what he saw. The reality on the ground was more complicated than either modern narrative can accommodate. The modern political use of the Crusades is largely a 19th and 20th century invention. European colonial powers in the Middle East sometimes frame their activities in crusading terms, which was both historically inaccurate and politically poisonous. Arab nationalist leaders in the 20th century responded by framing anti-colonial resistance in terms of the crusading era, treating the European presence as a new crusade requiring a new Saladin. These modern political uses of medieval history have almost nothing to do with what the Crusades actually were, but they have profoundly shaped how billions of people understand them. Now let us talk about what the Crusades actually accomplished and what they failed to accomplish. In purely military terms, the Crusades' record is mixed at best. The First Crusade was a stunning success by its own objectives. It established Crusader states in the Levant that lasted for nearly 2 centuries, but every subsequent major crusade either failed outright or achieved only temporary gains. The Second Crusade, launched in response to the fall of Edessa in 1144, ended in humiliating failure, including a disastrous attempt to besiege Damascus, a city that had been a useful neutral party, and was driven into Saladin's coalition partly by this attack. The Third Crusade recovered some coastal territory, but not Jerusalem. The Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople. The Fifth Crusade nearly captured Cairo before a catastrophic flood destroyed the army. The Sixth Crusade, led by the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, actually recovered Jerusalem through negotiation rather than warfare, which outraged the papacy so much that Frederick was excommunicated during his own crusade. The Seventh and Eighth Crusades, led by the French King Louis IX, both ended in catastrophe. Louis died of disease outside Tunis in 1270. The Crusader states were finally extinguished in 1291 when the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt captured Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold. The Crusaders had held territory in the Holy Land for almost exactly 2 centuries. They left almost no permanent political legacy in the region. But the Crusades' impact on Europe was transformative, and this is one of the most underappreciated aspects of the whole story. The Crusades accelerated the transfer of knowledge from the Islamic world to Europe. Crusaders and pilgrims brought back not just spices and silks, but ideas, mathematical concepts, medical knowledge, philosophical texts, agricultural techniques. The contact between European and Islamic civilization during the crusading era was one of the channels through which the intellectual heritage of ancient Greece, preserved and expanded by Islamic scholars, flowed back into Western Europe and helped seed the Renaissance. The Crusades also transformed European institutions. The need to finance and organize massive long-distance military campaigns drove innovations in banking, credit, and taxation. The Knights Templar, the military order that protected pilgrims, essentially invented the medieval banking system, allowing crusaders to deposit money in Europe and withdraw it in the Holy Land without physically transporting gold across dangerous territory. This was an early form of the letter of credit, a financial instrument that would eventually help build the commercial capitalism of the modern world. The Crusades transformed the Italian city-states. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa used their roles as suppliers and transporters of crusading armies to build commercial empires that dominated Mediterranean trade for centuries. The wealth generated by this trade financed the art, architecture, and intellectual life of the Italian Renaissance. In a very real sense, the Crusades helped pay for Michelangelo. The Crusades also intensified European anti-Semitism in ways that had catastrophic long-term consequences. The massacres of the First Crusade established a pattern of associating religious warfare with violence against Jewish communities. The crusading era saw the hardening of legal discrimination against Jews across Europe, the spread of blood libel accusations, and the eventual expulsion of Jewish communities from England in 1290, France in 1306, and Spain in 1492. The connection is not direct or simple, but the crusading movement contributed to an atmosphere of religious violence and exclusion that made Jewish life in medieval Europe increasingly precarious. There is one more misconception about the Crusades that deserves direct attention, and it concerns how the Islamic world actually responded to them at the time. Modern accounts often suggest that the Crusades were experienced as a civilizational trauma by the medieval Muslim world, a wound that was felt across the entire Islamic community. The historical evidence does not fully support this. For the first several decades after the First Crusade, the Muslim response was notably muted. The Crusader states were seen as a regional problem, not a global crisis. The Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, the nominal spiritual leader of Sunni Islam, issued no call to jihad. Muslim rulers in Egypt, Syria, and Iraq were more concerned with each other than with the Franks on the coast. It was not until the 12th century, particularly under the leadership of Zengi of Mosul and then his son Nur ad-Din, that a serious counter-crusading movement emerged, and even then it was as much about regional political consolidation as about religious obligation. Saladin himself spent more years fighting Muslim rivals than he spent fighting crusaders. The Great Jihad against the Franks was, in large part, a political project that used religious language to build coalitions and legitimacy. The framing of the Crusades as a defining trauma for Islamic civilization is largely a modern construction, developed in the 19th and 20th centuries as the Muslim world sought to understand and respond to European colonialism. Medieval Muslim historians wrote about the Crusades, but they did not place them at the center of their historical understanding the way modern discourse does. The 14th century Arab historian Ibn Khaldun, writing his monumental history of civilization, devoted far more attention to the Mongol invasions, which actually destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate and devastated the heartlands of Islamic civilization, than to the Crusader states, which were a persistent but manageable nuisance on the western fringe. This does not minimize the suffering the Crusades caused, it contextualizes it. And the difference between minimizing and contextualizing is exactly the difference between propaganda and history. So what is the honest summary? What were the Crusades, stripped of the myths? They were a series of military campaigns, primarily organized by the Latin Christian Church, aimed at recovering and holding Jerusalem and other sites considered sacred. They were launched for a mixture of religious, political, and economic motives that varied considerably between different participants and different campaigns. They were marked by extraordinary violence, including against fellow Christians and against Jewish communities in Europe. They were also marked by surprising moments of cultural exchange, pragmatic coexistence, and commercial cooperation. They failed in their primary military objective. The Holy Land was not permanently recovered for Christianity. They succeeded in transforming Europe in ways their organizers never intended, accelerating commercial development, spreading knowledge, and intensifying both religious devotion and religious violence. They were not a clash of civilizations because neither side was a unified civilization. They were not a simple story of aggression and defense because both sides attacked and both sides defended depending on the moment and the location. They were not the origin of Muslim-Christian conflict, because that conflict had much deeper roots and much more complex dynamics. And they were not, as some modern voices suggest, a noble chapter that should be celebrated or emulated. They were history, messy, human, driven by fear and faith and greed and genuine conviction, producing consequences that no one planned and no one could have predicted. There is a reason this matters beyond academic interest. When we get the Crusades wrong, we do not just misunderstand the medieval past, we misuse it. Every time a political leader invokes crusading language to justify military action, every time a religious community uses the Crusades as evidence of eternal civilizational warfare, every time a simplified version of this history is used to make complex modern conflicts seem inevitable and ancient, we are paying the price for historical ignorance. The Crusades lasted roughly 200 years. The myths about the Crusades have lasted 800 years and are still actively shaping how people think about religion, violence, and the relationship between the Western and Islamic worlds. That is a longer and in some ways more consequential legacy than anything that happened on the battlefield. Understanding what actually happened, why it happened, who was involved, what they wanted, what they got, and what it cost is not just an intellectual exercise. It is a form of intellectual self-defense against the people who want to use history as a weapon rather than a mirror. The real Crusades are more interesting than the myth. They are also more instructive. They show us a world where religious conviction and political calculation were inseparable, where enemies could be trading partners and allies could be rivals, where great violence could coexist with genuine cultural exchange, and where the consequences of decisions made in a field outside Clermont in 1095 would ripple across centuries in ways no one standing in that field could have imagined. That is what history actually is. Not a simple story of heroes and villains, not a template for modern politics. Not a wound to be nursed or a glory to be reclaimed. A record of human beings making decisions under pressure, in contexts they only partly understood, with consequences they could not foresee. The Crusades are one of the most important chapters in that record, and now, hopefully, you understand them a little more honestly than you did before. If this video changed how you think about the Crusades, or if it challenged something you thought you knew, I would genuinely love to hear about it in the comments. What surprised you most? What do you think still gets misrepresented? These conversations are what make this channel worth making. If you want to go deeper, the next video in this series looks at the Mongol invasions of the Islamic world, the event that Ibn Khaldun considered far more consequential than the Crusades, and the one that almost no one in the West knows enough about. It is a story that will completely reshape how you understand the medieval world. Subscribe if you have not already, and hit the bell so you do not miss it. History, this complicated, deserves more than one video. But before we close this chapter entirely, there is one more dimension of the Crusades that popular history almost always skips over, and it may be the most revealing of all. We talk about the Crusades as if they were exclusively a phenomenon of the Holy Land. Knights going east, fighting Muslims, coming home or dying there. That is the image. But the crusading movement was far broader than that, geographically and conceptually, and understanding its full scope changes everything about how we interpret it. The same papal machinery that launched armies toward Jerusalem also directed crusades against targets that had nothing to do with Islam. The Northern Crusades, sometimes called the Baltic Crusades, were campaigns waged against the pagan peoples of what is now Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, and parts of Poland and Russia. These campaigns began in the 12th century and continued well into the 14th. The Teutonic Knights, a military order originally founded to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land, eventually relocated almost entirely to the Baltic, where they spent generations conquering, converting, and colonizing pagan populations in campaigns that were formally designated as crusades and carried all the same spiritual rewards. The forced Christianization of the Baltic peoples was brutal and largely successful. The last openly pagan ruler in Europe, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, was not baptized until 1387. The Northern Crusades are almost never mentioned in popular discussions of the crusading movement, but they permanently shaped the political and cultural geography of Northern Europe. The modern nations of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania exist partly because of them. Then there were the Albigensian Crusades, launched not against Muslims or pagans but against fellow Christians. The Cathars, a religious movement centered in southern France that the Catholic Church considered heretical, were the target of a crusade called by Pope Innocent III in 1209. The Albigensian Crusade lasted 20 years and resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of people in southern France, the destruction of a distinctive regional culture, and the permanent incorporation of southern French territories into the French royal domain. The infamous phrase attributed to the papal legate at the siege of Béziers, "Kill them all, God will know his own," may be apocryphal, but it captured something real about the violence that was unleashed. The Reconquista in Spain, the centuries-long campaign by Christian kingdoms to recover the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule, was formally designated as a crusade at various points and drew crusaders from across Europe. It ended in 1492, the same year Columbus sailed west, the same year the Jews were expelled from Spain. These three events were not coincidental. They were connected expressions of a particular vision of Christian Spain that the crusading movement had helped create. There were crusades against the Hussites in Bohemia in the 15th century, against political enemies of various popes, against the Ottoman Turks as they advanced into Europe. The crusading idea proved remarkably flexible. It could be applied to almost any enemy the papacy chose to designate, as long as the spiritual machinery of indulgences and holy war could be credibly invoked. This flexibility is itself revealing. It tells us that the crusading movement was not fundamentally about Jerusalem or about Islam. It was about a particular theory of Christian society, one in which the Church had the authority to direct military violence toward the purification and expansion of Christendom. Jerusalem was the most powerful symbol of that project, but it was not its only expression or even its most lasting one. Understanding the Crusades as a broad movement rather than a specific series of campaigns in the Holy Land also helps explain why they ended, or more precisely, why they faded rather than ending cleanly. There was no single moment when the crusading era concluded. The fall of Acre in 1291 ended the Crusader states in the Holy Land, but crusading rhetoric and crusading campaigns continued for centuries afterward. The last formal crusade is often dated to the late 17th century. What changed was not a decision to stop crusading, but a gradual shift in the political and intellectual climate of Europe, driven by the Renaissance, the Reformation, the rise of national states that competed with papal authority, and eventually the Enlightenment's critique of religious warfare. The Protestant Reformation was particularly significant. When Martin Luther broke with Rome in the 16th century, the unified Christian world that crusading required ceased to exist. You cannot call a crusade when half of Europe denies the Pope's authority to call one. The crusading movement depended on a particular structure of Christian unity and papal power that the Reformation permanently shattered. This brings us to something worth sitting with for a moment. The crusading movement was, among other things, an expression of medieval European Christianity at the height of its institutional confidence. The papacy in the 12th and 13th centuries wielded a kind of authority over European politics that it has never recovered. The ability to call a crusade, to offer spiritual rewards for military service, to direct the violence of European nobility toward chosen enemies, was an extraordinary concentration of soft and hard power combined. The eventual failure of that power, the inability to hold Jerusalem, the catastrophe of the Fourth Crusade, the humiliations of the later campaigns, contributed to a long erosion of papal authority that culminated in the Reformation. In this sense, the Crusades helped destroy the medieval Catholic Church's political dominance, not by external attack, but by overextension and failure. The institution that launched the Crusades was not the same institution that watched them fade. It had been changed, diminished, and challenged by the very enterprise it had created. That is a pattern worth recognizing. Institutions that overreach, that promise more than they can deliver, that invest their authority in projects that ultimately fail, are changed by those failures in ways they cannot control. The medieval papacy launched the Crusades partly to consolidate its power. The Crusades ultimately contributed to the fragmentation of that power. History rarely delivers the consequences that its actors intend. There is also a quieter legacy that deserves acknowledgement, one that does not fit neatly into either the heroic or the condemnatory narrative. Thousands of ordinary people who went on crusade were not primarily motivated by greed, land hunger, or political calculation. Many of them were genuinely devout individuals who believed they were doing what God required of them, who sold everything they owned to finance the journey, who left their families knowing they might never return, who endured extraordinary hardship in what they understood as an act of love and sacrifice. Many of them died, some of them committed terrible acts, some of them showed remarkable courage and endurance. They were human beings operating within a framework of belief and obligation that we can understand historically even when we cannot share it. Dismissing them as simply fanatics or villains is as much a distortion as celebrating them as heroes. The moral complexity of the Crusades includes the moral complexity of the people who fought them on all sides. The Muslim soldiers who defended their cities, the Jewish communities who were caught between forces that neither claimed nor protected them, the Eastern Christians who found themselves occupied by fellow Christians who treated them as heretics. The Byzantine emperors who had asked for help and received a catastrophe, the merchants who profited from both sides, the scholars who carried ideas across the lines of conflict, all of these people were part of the story, all of them deserved to be seen. History at its best is an act of imaginative empathy. Not sympathy, not approval, but the genuine effort to understand how the world looked from inside a different time, a different set of beliefs, a different set of pressures and possibilities. The Crusades are one of the great tests of that empathy, because they have been so thoroughly claimed by modern agendas that seeing the actual people behind the events requires real effort. That effort is worth making, because the alternative, the simplified story of noble warriors or bloodthirsty fanatics, of eternal civilizational conflict or triumphant religious expansion, does not illuminate the past. It just uses the past as a mirror to reflect our present anxieties back at us with an ancient frame around them. The Crusades happened. They were real. They were complicated. They left a world changed in ways no one planned, for better and for worse. And the reverberations of those changes are still moving through history, through the borders of modern nations, through the fault lines of religious communities, through the architecture of cities and the collections of museums, and the vocabulary of political speeches. Knowing what actually happened, holding the complexity without flinching from it, is the beginning of understanding not just the medieval past, but the world those centuries helped create. That is what this channel is for, not to give you simple stories, but to give you true ones, and to trust that the truth, even when it is complicated, is more interesting and more useful than any myth. If you made it this far, thank you, genuinely. These are not easy topics to sit with, and the fact that you stayed through the complexity says something good about your curiosity. Drop a comment below with the one thing from this video that most surprised you, or the one piece of the standard Crusades narrative that you now see differently. I read every comment, and those conversations often shape what the next video covers. If you have not subscribed yet, now is a good moment. The next video in this series goes deep into the Mongol conquests and what they actually meant for the Islamic world, for Christian Europe, and for the shape of the modern world. It is a story that makes the Crusades look almost small by comparison, and I promise it will surprise you just as much as this one did. History is never what we think it is. That is exactly why it is worth understanding.